Okay. I'd like to welcome everybody. It really is just nice to see you all, and as we're gathering, we're getting more people coming in. It's been great because we've had close to 40 people at almost every one of our events, and it really is a terrific testament to all of you and to all the presentations that we've had. We want to thank you all for being here. I know we're going to be missing one person tonight. And that's Bill's longtime partner, Ron, who died this fall. And Ron would be here smiling, joining with us. And for those who knew him and loved him as we all did, we're sorry he's not here. But he is in spirit, and I know it'll be an event that he'd be proud of, Bill. And so thank you.
Huff, I'm going to
Yeah,
interrupt you just a minute. If you could all put yourselves on mute
you.
except
Thank you.
Bill and Alan and Huff, so I don't have to mute you individually, it would be help. Thanks. Sorry,
Thanks.
Huff.
Thanks, Larry. That's great. Okay. We're not going to, for another thing, we're not going to be going into breakout sessions tonight. We're going to do just question and answers afterwards. And I don't know whether a lot of you know, but you can, on the React piece, you can push that and put your hand up. And that's very helpful when you've got a question. If you don't know how to do that, you could still raise your hand and we'll get to you. But I just wanted to let you know that as we get going, that would be something that it makes it a lot easier for us to have the questions come in and be able to have Bill answer them. Um, I just wanted to start and to say really that Bill has the event that we've got tonight, a life helping to preserve and make accessible the natural and cultural treasures of Massachusetts. It really has been interesting to work with Bill on this thing because both Alan and I, after seeing the pictures you're going to see tonight and hearing some of the stories, know that Massachusetts has been very, very lucky to have had Bill to set aside several of its gems, natural gems, and also to work on its cultural history. And we just really are very happy to have him here tonight with us. And I think one of the things that I just want to run through a little bit is just uh, what the story was for getting Bill to the point where he started that whole process, and then he'll take us from there. But he was a native of Vermont, and he graduated with all of us in at Williams, uh, majoring in history, and then spent 2 years at Merton College, Oxford University, as a Rhodes Scholar. He obtained his master's degree in philosophy, politics, and economics, and then he went on to Naval Officers Candidate School, and he served for 3 years as an officer on the USS Goldsboro, a guided missile destroyer that was home ported in Pearl Harbor and participated in the Vietnam War and toured the Pacific from Japan to Australia. After finishing that, he went on to Harvard Law School, and then from Harvard Law School on to a Boston law firm as legal and became legal counsel for Massachusetts Office of Coastal Management. He then spent 9 years as the deputy director and acting director of the Trustees of Reservation, which he will talk about and let you know what that means, and became the president and CEO of Mount Auburn Cemetery for 20 years. In retirement, after retiring from Mount Auburn Cemetery, he served as treasurer and then the board chair of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and then as vice chair and treasurer of the Friends of the Public Garden. Bill, I'd like to have you take it away, and really appreciate your speaking with us tonight.
Well, thank you all for setting aside an hour or so of your evening to listen to my story. It's been fun. It forced me to think back on a life, as I think all of us, as we approach or have reached 80, we naturally think back and how did we get where we are? And I'm going to just quickly run through a little bit of what you've embellished, a little bit of what you've heard, because I was very fortunate in being able to take a lot of my interests, my personal interests and activities, and turn them into a professional career, which was not my intent at the beginning. This has been a winding road that I had no idea where it would lead, but I'm going to tell you the story. I grew up in Woodstock, Vermont, which for Vermont is a fairly sophisticated town in terms of its wonderful architecture and the people who live there. Many of them came from other places to retire, and they all had an influence on my life. My parents were avid outdoors people. We spent a lot of time hiking and being out of doors. My father loved gardening. My mother was an ardent skier, among many other talents. So I learned very early. And Dave Reichert and I raced against each other when we were probably 10 or 11. I don't remember exactly. Little knowing where we'd end up a few years later. I did some horseback riding and ran into Morgie Neals, again, little knowing that we'd end up at Williams together. All of that, and then sailing in the summer, all of which contributed to bits of my life. Family connections were very important. I've been very fortunate in the interrelationship of family friends and other friends over the years that have enabled me to do what I did. Ever since eighth grade, I wanted to be a lawyer. And but it took a long time before I got there because I went to prep school in Connecticut. I spent a year in England as an exchange student, and of course came to Williams, and then was at Oxford for 2 years, sailing over there with Neil O'Donnell in a small sailboat, which somewhat made my reputation in Oxford. It was a fabulous experience, as you can imagine, building on my history to be able to sit down on a weekly basis with the official biographer, Winston Churchill. It was very special, learning about not just about Churchill, but how you go about writing history. Sir Martin Gilbert was amazing. He was at the beginning of his career, and he went on and unfortunately has died, but wrote many books. I was so privileged to know him. The Navy was not something I wanted to do. Probably most of us who went into the service, it wasn't what we wanted to do, but I learned a lot. As is so typical, you go in not knowing much, and you're put in charge of a whole bunch of enlisted men who know a whole lot more about what you're doing than you do, and you have to somehow forge that relationship and become an effective leader. So that was a good learning process. Then I finally got to Harvard, and I don't know whether any of you remember the film The Paper Chase, but it was very much my experience. It was pretty terrifying. Made a little easier because I'd been used to being yelled at by captains in the Navy, but having law professors lit into you was not fun. But I wrote a paper on New England wetlands legislation, which gave you a sense of my interest. Environmental law wasn't as big a deal then as it is now. And then they let me take 3 months off, and I went to work for an organization called the Conservation Law Foundation. And I suddenly realized that the law really could be a lot more fun than proofreading municipal bond prospectuses. And again, fate intervened. An oil tanker went off, sank off the coast of Massachusetts. Everybody was all up in arms. And I walked in the door and had been in the Navy, a lifelong sailor. I knew about the sea and got to do some very exciting work, all of which eventually led me to want to leave the law firm. And I was lucky once again. My landlord had just been asked to head up this new coastal zone management program, which was instituted by the federal government to encourage states to take care of their coastal zone, where there's a lot of competition for industry, for conservation, for recreation, and trying to set up regulations to control all of that. And that was an amazing experience. And I didn't decide to stay in the long run, but I had one wonderful case that I participated in which the Commonwealth of Massachusetts sued all the oil companies and the federal government to prevent lease sales off of Georges Bank, one of the world's most productive fishing areas. And I was a very, very junior part of the team, but it turned out that we won at the federal court, and then at the appeals court, the judge was none other than an old family friend, and he wrote a fabulous opinion that could only have been written by somebody who knew the sea. And I later made 2 trips to Bermuda with him. So we won there, and we were literally at Logan, ready to fly to Washington when everybody caved. And there's been no lease sale off of the Atlantic coast, I don't think, ever since. But exciting as that was, I realized the law really wasn't my cup of tea. And the senior partner of my law firm came to my rescue, and he was also board chair of an organization called the Trustees of Reservations, which is an odd title, perhaps. And they have the chutzpah now to call themselves the trustees, as though there were no other trustees in the world, but it seems to have worked. But the idea was that when I went to work there was 67 reservations, places set aside for public use. They're now up to over 120. So it's a much, much larger organization. But I was in sort of not at the beginning, because it was founded in 1891, but it had a very low staff numbers, and the director needed somebody to come in and manage the staff that was looking after all the properties. So I got to travel all over Massachusetts, and let's go ahead and have the first map, Alan. As you can see, there are properties all over the state, and my job was to supervise all the people out in the field. Well, like the Navy, they knew a hell of a lot more about all kinds of things than I did, but I was their interface with the headquarters in Boston, and once again, we were able to forge a very meaningful relationship. In fact, I just had lunch with one of the guys a couple of days ago, who's now 90. So I got to travel around the state. I got to meet all kinds of fascinating people. And just while we have the map down at the bottom there, Martha's Vineyard, if you're not familiar with it, at Nantucket next to it, did not have senior staff. They had people who lived on the islands, but I was, by default, was the liaison to headquarters. So I spent a lot of time flying down to both islands and got to love them dearly. However, the 2 islands don't like to talk to each other very well, so politics raised its head from the beginning. And in fact, all over the state, we would have local committees who wanted to do what they wanted to do. And then we came in and said, well, we're a statewide organization and we've got to do this, that, or the other. But if you could point down there at, Long Point Wildlife Refuge, you see on the south coast of Martha's Vineyard, and then up above Boston, Long Hill. I'm going to talk about those 2 properties now. Okay, next slide. It was almost the exact time I walked in the door as the new deputy director, then the widow of the owner of this property died, and that meant that it then came into our ownership and public use. So my job was to turn this magnificent house and gardens into a public reservation. Next. The house was reconstructed out of old brick that came from a tear down nearby. And inside, the next slide, inside, they bought woodwork from a house that was demolished in Charleston, South Carolina, very probably fashioned by enslaved people. And you see the Chinese wallpaper there. Next. So, and then next again, I mean, magnificent. So this house, which had been a private summer home for a family, Ellery Sedgwick, from the famous Sedgwick family out in Western Massachusetts, and longtime editor of the Atlantic Monthly, now became a public reservation. Next. And the gardens outside were spectacular. But there again, we had a group of ladies who had known the two Mrs. Sedgwicks who had created the garden. They had very set ideas on what they wanted to have happen. We had some slightly different ideas on because it was now a public reservation, and that called forth all my skills as a diplomat. Next. Another garden feature. Later on, the house became the headquarters of the trustees, and my office was here for many years, which was a very pleasant place to work. Next. The other property that came into our hands just at the time I arrived was this magnificent property on the south coast of Martha's Vineyard. As you can see, 580 acres, extensive barrier beach, saltwater pond, lowlands there of scrub, just the most beautiful property you can imagine in the summertime. Next. The way to get to the property was down this labyrinthian dirt road. And we had a number of neighbors, of course, who had bought their properties to have quiet getaways. And they also weren't at all happy with the idea that this was now going to become a public reservation, open to the public. There was going to be traffic and noise and so forth. So once again, I had to play the diplomat with the local group. The one thing they wanted to do was put up right away a sign, no dogs, no radios, no nudity. And but we eventually, over time, worked our way and everybody settled down. Ironically, one of the neighbors that I dealt with most was Tony Lewis, the longtime columnist for the New York Times, known for his very liberal views, but he was not liberal when it came to admitting the public to a property next door to him. But we managed to stay friends, and later on, which is a recurrent theme of this talk, people I met in one institution turn up in the next institution, and I ended up writing his memorial minute in the proceedings of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Next. Just the most perfect place to go on a summer day and swim and relax. I was able to take my family there. I said to the caretaker in that house that you saw earlier, why don't you take the weekend off and we're going to come and run the reservation for you. So I got to get in the Jeep and run up and down the beach and pretend I was the superintendent. It was quite wonderful. Next. It's an extraordinary world and it's very fragile. And as you can imagine, there's been a lot of change. The trustees are one of the largest owners of land in private owners of land in Massachusetts, and certainly maybe the largest, other than the state, owner of oceanfront property. But it was a wonderful way to earn my living, was to have to go down there and deal with problems every once in a while. I got to go my first fishing experience on one of these beaches with the local expert. Next. World's End, which is just south of Boston, really part of Boston Harbor, is one of the crown jewels of the trustees. It's about 250 acres. It was a farm And then the owner hired Frederick Law Olmsted, the great landscape architect, to lay it out with roads, which you see here, and it was going to be a housing development. Well, fortunately, that never occurred. It was also proposed for a nuclear power station. It was also proposed as the headquarters for the United Nations. None of those things came to pass, and eventually it came into the hands of the trustees and is next one of the most beautiful places to enjoy the out of doors. Two drumlins connected by a small spit there. Next, looking back at the Boston skyline. Next. Appleton Farms in Ipswich, north of Boston, the oldest farm in America, still in use. The owners had to give it up, arranged upon their death that it would come to the trustees. It's enormous, and the trustees are very involved in agriculture and put it to good use. It's a very, very old Boston family, the Appletons. They had their own private railway station, which was resurrected a few years ago, which I attended an anniversary party for the trustees, and we had a special train that went from Boston and stopped at their private station, which is kind of cool. Very reminiscent of all those great English estates that I spent so much time visiting when I was living in England. Next. This is one of the riding trails. The owners loved to hunt and ride, and they were connected to Harvard, of course. So these are the pinnacles that were saved from one of the old Harvard buildings, and they set them up as sort of ornaments in the landscape. Next. Castle Hill, also in Ipswich. Quite a piece of real estate. Perhaps best known for its fabulous beach down there that you can see, but also for the great house here, which was modeled after a big estate in England, with this amazing alley that runs down to the ocean. Next. The original house built by the Crane family, a plumbing family from Chicago, was Italianate, hence the swimming pool complex down here in the foreground. But apparently Mrs. Crane decided she didn't like Italianate when it was built, and so they tore it all down and then built this Georgian house at the top. But I spent a lot of time working with volunteers to bring in, the house was left totally empty when the family left it to the trustees. We joked that they didn't even leave the light bulbs. And it's taken decades of work to bring back furniture, bring appropriate paintings, et cetera, and I worked a lot on that. Next. There's the front. One of my tasks was to read the script for The Witches of Eastwick, which they wanted to film here to make sure it wasn't too racy for the Trustees of Reservations. My conclusion was it wasn't particularly racy. I just thought it was pretty dull, actually. But anyway, they filmed it there, and you can see the incredible detail and the view through the house to the ocean side. Next. Nearby is the Coolidge Reservation, a wonderful spit of land. Boston is just off on the horizon to the right. You can't really see it in this picture, but there's an outline of an enormous McKim, Mead and White designed country estate, Gilded Age estate that was built there, which was eventually torn down. They left just an outline of the foundation. And the reason, in a way, that I'm showing you this, other than it's a beautiful property, is the Coolidge family is very connected with the Massachusetts Historical Society and indeed Mount Auburn, and we'll talk about that a little later. Next. That's just another shot looking back towards Manchester Harbor. Cape Pogue on Chappaquiddick, Martha's Vineyard. Another place I spent a lot of time working with the local owners there, who were all very supportive of the trustees. One of them was a Nobel Prize physician, a delightful man. It was fun to get to know these people. Next. There's the lighthouse. Next. In the far western part of the state, Great Barrington, you get a sense of the variety of landscapes that the trustees hold. This is a mountain, very popular hiking spot. Next. And then another one of our great houses, Nomke, the home of Joseph Choate, who was our ambassador to Great Britain at the end of the Victorian era. The family wanted to hire Frederick Law Olmsted, but he came in and said, I want to take down this oak tree on the right there. And that was their favorite tree. And they said, no, we'll go with someone else. Thank you. Next. There's the front of the house. The project that was underway when I arrived at the trustees was re-roofing that. And as you can imagine, with all those shingles, all those little turrets, and really, it puts our maintenance staff through their paces to manage construction of that kind of stuff. But it's a wonderful house inside. It was designed as a summer house, but when you go to it today, you could imagine being there and in the off season. Next. We decided at one point we would have a Christmas party there. A big mistake. You can't really see it in this picture, but the ceiling is made up of rice paper pieces out of tea boxes. And as we turned on the heat, they all began to come off the ceiling. And so we decided that winter events in this house were not a good idea. But you can see the kind of furnishings, again, very much like these grand English estates. Next. This was the daughter, Mabel Choate, who inherited the property and then just went on to expand the gardens. It's on a hill, as you can see, and she wanted to walk down the hill to her flower garden. So next, this was the result. Very famous. Wait a second, go back. Famous in a lot of landscape architecture books, the blue stairs, which have all recently been redone. We had to take out, well, I wasn't involved. This was after my time. We took out all the birch trees, had to replant them all. And it's quite a spectacular way to get to your cutting garden. Next. And this is the afternoon garden. Our wonderful supervisor who managed the properties in that area had to find some enormous pieces of rope like that and went to the USS Constitution in Boston, and the Navy managed to find him some rope to put between these Venetian gondola poles. I mean, this was a Mabel Choate design with Fletcher Steele, the great landscape architect. Really magnificent garden. And you can see the view out over the Berkshires, quite spectacular. Site of wonderful summer parties every year. Next. A little further south, right in the corner of Connecticut and Massachusetts, absolutely spectacular views from this field. And the cobble has a lot of very endangered species, very important for biological reasons. Next. And finally, Field Farm in Williamstown. I hope many of you have been there. Some of you may have stayed at the house. That, of course, is Greylock and the Hopper. Next. Larry Blodell built this mid-century modern house, which is now a bed and breakfast. And Ulrich Franzen, a more modern architect, built the little guest house to the left. I met Mr. Blodell thanks to Lane Faison. I took a lot of art history courses with Lane, and he invited Mr. Blodell to come in because although Blodell was a scion of the great timber family out in the Pacific Northwest, he didn't have any interest in that. He was interested in collecting art. And his collection On his death, went half to the Whitney Museum and half to the museum, Williams College Museum. But it was delightful to have him talk at our class. And then a few years later, walking down the street in London when I was at Oxford, who should I run into? Mr. Blodell. Mrs. Blodell had me to lunch once when we were talking about the property coming to the trustees. And then as I was acting director at the time when she died, I went to her funeral at the Episcopal Church in Williamstown. A wonderful, wonderful couple, and it's absolutely beautiful property. So that's the Trustees of Reservations. You can see great variety of work. I learned a tremendous amount, but the time came for me to want to move on and perhaps have an organization of my own. Next. Now, I've often asked why on earth did I end up at Mount Auburn Cemetery? And Alan can perhaps show us on the map here of Boston. There it is there. It's actually a little bit in Cambridge, mostly in Watertown, but you can see it's fairly close to the downtown Boston. And when it was founded, it was considered very much a Boston institution. People would walk from downtown Boston to the cemetery in those days. And then there was later a horse-drawn trolley car. Well, I was looking for a new job, and my old boss at the Trustees of Reservations happened to be a trustee of Mount Auburn Cemetery. And he said, "We're looking for a new president." And my reaction was, "Gordon, why on earth would I want to go work for a cemetery?" He said, "Just go have a look." So I went and had a look. I'd never been there before. Next. It's 150 acres now. Absolutely spectacular landscape. An arboretum, a botanical garden, a cemetery, historic site. I'll talk about all of that a little later. This map is probably the result of the most important thing I did there over a 3-year period. We created a master plan for the property so that it could remain its essential, have its essential features remain, and that we knew what we were doing. There was a plan, and as you can see, there are different colored areas. It's like the analogy I always said, it was like a historic house that's gone through many owners and many periods of time. You might have a living room that was a federal period. You might have a kitchen that was Victorian. You might have a sitting room, which was mid-century modern. Mount Auburn has evolved over the years. It's not a static historic site. And so this was helping us figure out the different areas and how we should manage the landscape and replace trees and plants when they left. Next. One of the things I did at the beginning was have a complete signage developed. Whenever I go to historic sites, I'm always interested in how they sign things. How do they direct people around? Some people are good, some people aren't so good. This is the entrance with our 1898 chapel. But the point is here, visitors are welcome. America's first landscape cemetery, consecrated in 1831, a National Historic Landmark. Burial space available. Now, everybody has been coming to Mount Auburn for 180 years. That wasn't something I started, but we made it much more known in the community, made sure everybody felt welcome, and we figured out why it was so important. It's in so many landscape architecture books in the history of our country. And I finally came up with a set of words that I think encapsulates its importance. It was the first large-scale, 100 acres, designed landscape open to the public in North America. And you notice the word cemetery isn't in there. It was a cemetery, but it was also a botanic garden from the very beginning. The Massachusetts Horticultural Society was the group that founded it. We later parted ways, because the cemetery became so popular. But we never lost sight that it was first and foremost a great landscape. Next. Outside the city, looking back to the city, rolling hills, ponds, just a magnificent arboretum. And I was able, during my tenure, to get the National Park Service to recognize a cemetery almost for the first time as a National Historic Landmark, which is the highest designation. They were very good about putting that on buildings, but somehow landscapes took them a while to agree to. Next. One of my first jobs was to make sure the infrastructure, the building infrastructure was good. We redid all the garages because to run 175 acres with 400 burials a year, maybe 200,000 visitors, we had a full-time staff of over 60, and they needed a good place to work and store their vehicles. So that was a major project at the beginning. We also had to redo the administration building, get rid of the drop ceilings, get rid of the green vinyl desks, and make it worthy of a place that was very special in Boston history. Next. Then you have to look after the landscape. The ponds get silted up. There's not much of a run through. And so we dredged the two-part lake so that next the water could run under the bridge again, and we're back to this beautiful pastoral landscape. Next. One of my most exciting projects was in 1999 to read that 4 magnificent Japanese maple trees that are in the courtyard of the Boston Public Library were going to be cut down because the library was going to do a different landscape plan. And the light bulb went off in my head, and I got a hold of the Back Bay Garden Club, the Friends of the Public Garden, and the Friends of Mount Auburn, and said, let's, the library collects books, we collect trees. Let's see if we can do something. So we raised the money, 4 root balls, each weighing 5 tons, hand dug, because you can't get a backhoe in the middle of the courtyard of the library. Next. Up and away. Next. And here they are at Mount Auburn, luckily all 4 doing very, very well. You should have seen the faces of the people walking by in the street outside the library when these 4 trees came over the roof onto big trucks. It was a day I'll never forget. Next. Another project dear to my heart was to create a suitable landscape in front of this historic chapel, the first building built at Mount Auburn, and in front of this iconic Civil War memorial, the Sphinx. As you can read there, American Union preserved, African slavery destroyed by the uprising of a great people and the blood of fallen heroes. There were roadways running through this area. Next. I got rid of the roadways. We built paths. We put in landscaping, trees. The tree on the left here is the only tree, I don't know, we have thousands of trees at Mount Auburn, but only one is really special because we know who planted it. And sadly, when I was there, the tree became so old it had to be taken down, but we had arranged for scions to be grown at the Arnold Arboretum. And so this is the scion that came in to replace. Meaning it's the same genetic material. And the reason this tree is so special, planted in 1860 by the Prince of Wales, who later became King Edward VII. And the fact that he came to Mount Auburn and planted a tree gives you some sense in 1860 of the reputation of Mount Auburn. When visitors came, this was a place they were always brought. Next. Here's the Sphinx. There were just a few juniper trees around it, shrubs, and no garden at all. I mean, this is the entrance to the chapel where we have so many services. I wanted people to be able to gather beforehand or after a service in a place of beauty like the rest of the landscape, instead of standing on roadways. So that was a wonderful achievement. Next. Another major landscape project. This is one of our larger monuments. This is the burial place of Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science. And it's hard to see in this slide, but on either side of the stairway, you might just be able to make out some carvings, absolutely gorgeous low relief carvings. They were hidden by juniper trees. There were evergreens, all came down in a storm. We knew we had to do something. So we went back to the archives of the church. We developed a very good relationship with them, and we got back to what had been the original landscape, carefully sculpting that slope down to the water, getting rid of all the invasive plants at the bottom. Now, I'm not a landscape architect, and I'm a quintessential generalist. I know a little about a lot of things, but not deeply about much of anything. So I always hired landscape architects. And of course, we had to hire, like digging those trees, we hired the best tree person in Boston to move trees around. And I always said it's a three-legged stool. There's the owner, there's the architect, whether it's a landscape architect or a building architect, and there's the contractor. And those three entities have to get along or the stool is not very stable. And this was a case in which it was wobbling. So rarely, as president, was I dragged out into the middle of these things. But I remember coming out and the contractor and the architect were literally swearing at each other and looking to me to decide how we would sculpt this slope. Well, we got it done. And that was another memorable moment. Next. Here it is. A beautiful, beautiful monument. Next. One of the new innovations, when I came, they were these lots, which have, in many cases, granite curbings around them, have grass in the middle. And when I came, the staff were lifting running lawnmowers up the steps and putting them down to mow the grass. And clearly that was not a good idea. And we decided really mowing the grass was a big pain in the neck. What if we just use these places to expand our horticultural palette? And so in many cases, this is not historical. It wasn't necessarily done at the time these lots were created, but we think it adds to the atmosphere of and notice there's a hat and sword on top of that monument there in the back with all the battles that he fought in the Civil War around the monument. The one to the left, further left. See the hat? There's the hat and sword. You can't really see it here. Wonderful monuments. Next. The first Washington Monument, long before the one in Washington was here, to commemorate George Washington. You climb to the top and get a magnificent view out over all of Boston. The reason I'm showing you this is a wildflower garden. It was just a bare slope that was just cut grass all the time. The horticulture team decided to create a wonderful wildflower garden there. Next. Now, one of the challenges was, were we going to continue to be an active cemetery? There wasn't much room left. How were we going to stay in business? So with the help of another landscape architect, we decided to build this wonderful wall, which, as you can see, functions as memorial space, as though someone had their own monument, but it's part of a landscape feature that doesn't intrude on the landscape the way a lot of individual markers would. Now, we knew when this was the very first of many of these what I thought of as innovative solutions to our problem. And I wondered whether it would be successful, whether people would like this idea. And we knew that if we built enough places for, casket burial, that was much in demand, there'd be no problem, and then we would have cremated remains buried here in the front. Well, it sold like hotcakes, and we did very well. Next. This was another innovative idea, taking an area that was just trees and shrubs. And so we developed this scheme of putting these flat markers in. Next, I think there's a close-up. Yes. These are what we call shared memorials. A whole bunch of people are on these, maybe 20 or 25. It reduces the cost, it reduces the impact on the landscape, and yet provides people with a place. And one of our classmates, John Lovell, is here with his name on one of these plaques. Next. Another area that needed work was this sculpture, which was there when I arrived, but there was nothing around it. It was just grass on this hillside. And I thought, this is not very interesting, and we need more space for cremated remains burial, and always wanted to give people a chance to put their names and dates. And so we created this sinuous bed of granite, which again, every section is in effect your private memorial with some bench space in between, and then make it into a garden. Next. This was the final and largest project in my term. This is at the edge of the cemetery with a big road running by overlooking a very unattractive city of Cambridge cemetery. We wanted some sense of closure to our cemetery for people to feel like they were in a special space, but we didn't want to block out in some areas views over to some of the old monuments in the Cambridge cemetery, hence this wall and fence notion. We created a new little pond there with a waterfall, new garden space. Next slide. Oh, okay. No, go back. I guess we ditched that one. But each one of these large plaques, you could buy the whole plaque, or it could be subdivided. And then up above in the band were the areas for cremated remains. And the burials were all in front of this wall. It was a massive project, but it ends up giving, as I say, a nice perimeter to the cemetery. Next. Monuments was an area that I felt needed a lot of work. Nobody was paying any attention to these wonderful monuments, and this was the first project we worked on. This is the burial space for Charles Bulfinch, who was considered to be the first professional American architect. He designed the State House in Boston. He designed the original dome of the Capitol, which has largely been built over. He was a remarkable man. Anyway, this was his, and the urn, when I came, was tilting. We didn't know, we thought it was kind of alarming. We didn't really know how it was built. It turns out that there's an iron rod in there, and this urn probably came from England because it's made out of different material than the stone. But we had the plaques all removed and put back, and made sure the monument was secure. Next. This is one of our most significant monuments because it was carved by Thomas Crawford, a very famous mid-19th century sculptor who sculpted the Statue of Freedom. This is on the top of the US Capitol. He worked in Rome. Amos Binney, a doctor, went to Rome, died there. His widow commissioned this uh, wonderful sculpture. As you see, the urn, the draped, or the shroud draped over the top. This is a badly deteriorated angel. There's another image on the other side. And so we created, this was just sitting in grass, and we created this wonderful surround for it. There's not much you can do with the marble monuments. Next. They are covered with acid snow all winter, and you can see what happens to the fingers. The marble is typically Italian, and it's very soft. It's what Michelangelo used, but it doesn't do well outdoors. But we have a lot of these, and we developed a program in which we could clean them and try to prolong their life. We're never going to preserve them forever. Next. And I was honored when I retired, a fund was set up in my name to help clean and preserve these monuments. And this is a before picture of a monument that was cleaned with funds from that fund. Pretty spectacular kind of thing, but you can see the deterioration of the hand and other elements. It's very hard keeping these things alive. Okay, next. Fences, another. We have a wonderful collection of now about 60 of these fences. There were hundreds and hundreds of them originally. They're very hard to keep up. The families are not keeping them up anymore, so we've taken them on, and that's another project of our preservation group. Go ahead. They're wonderful works of art. And interestingly, the 60 that we have, not a single one is a duplicate. These were bought out of catalogs, but our collection of 60 is different, every single one of them. Next. Now, to support this expanded preservation effort, we needed more space, workshops, etc. And so we were able to buy a house that looked like that house back there, that's right adjacent to the cemetery. You see here, our garage is here. And no sooner had we bought it than I discovered that it had to be condemned by the town of Watertown because it was falling down. And I thought, oh, here goes my reputation. But we were able to persuade the town to allow us to build a new building exactly on the same footprint. We couldn't make it bigger. And next. No, don't show it. But anyway, we got a wonderful workspace with offices and actually a living space for a staff member in the back. Next. We have an incredible archives there, and it was sitting in deteriorating boxes in the basement with mildew everywhere when I arrived, and I made sure that we took preventive measures. And over the years, this wonderful woman on the right, who I hired, has been our curator of historical collections, which are extensive: papers, photos, paintings, all kinds of sculpture, all kinds of family mementos that have been given to us over the years. Next. I've sent many authors to our archives when they're writing biographies of people buried at Mount Auburn, and they find little nuggets that we have that they never otherwise would have found. Next. Isabella Stewart Gardner, creator of the Gardner Museum. This is her family tomb. And this is another theme that has run through the Gardner family. I got to know one of them through my work with the Trustees of Reservations. And her mother died and left money that she had the ability to give to a nonprofit. And I suggested, well, we need some preservation work on the door of the family tomb. Maybe you could make a gift for that, which she did. So very satisfying to bring people from different institutions together. Next. The new regime, two presidents now from my era, are building on what I built and left them. The master plan is still followed, but they are ever increasing ways to bring the public into the cemetery and enjoy this wonderful space. And this was an event that happened just a few months ago. Dinner under the oaks. You can see the Sphinx there. Next. And this is our own Scott Baker's oldest son, Ed, and he lives across the street from the cemetery. And Scott told me, you know, Ed and his family and his brother and his family, they have to walk way around to get into Mount Auburn. Is there any way we could open up a gate or something? And after a lot of discussion and a lot of effort by the cemetery, I introduced Ed and his brother to the president. And the result was that Ed, who's done very well in investing in Uber, gave a magnificent gift to the cemetery to provide actually 4 pedestrian gates. So once again, the ability to bring people together across all kinds of unexpected connections is really nice. Next. Okay, before I retired, but I had gotten involved with the Massachusetts Historical Society because of that judge I talked about who wrote the wonderful opinion, the family friend who I did a lot of sailing with. He was the board chair and he said, you should be a trustee. And I said, I love history. I don't know that much about American history because I studied European history with Waite and Bostard and Ballman and so forth, and did my thesis in British political history and then worked with Sir Martin Gilbert in England. But yeah, I'd love to come on board. Next. So here is their 1899 magnificent headquarters in Boston. And I went on the board and served in a variety of functions, committee chairs, became the treasurer, and ultimately board chair myself. Next. This is the reading room where untold books of American history have been researched and written. One of the joys was to get to meet and chat with historians like David McCullough, who said when he comes to the Massachusetts Historical Society and goes into the stacks next, the hairs on the back of his head go up. I mean, he's reading John Adams' letters to his wife. He's reading all these original documents that are stored, millions of these documents. Next. This is a letter that John Adams wrote to Abigail from Philadelphia on July 3rd, 1776, telling her that we had declared our independence. And as you may know, he always felt that July 3rd should be the date that we celebrated it. But it took, I suppose, like the Congress today, a little while to get everything squared away. And it wasn't until the 4th that it got sort of officially promulgated. But to see and not hold, because we, you know, unless you have gloves on, but to see this kind of original part of our history. And it goes on and on. And I mean, we have John Adams' scribbles on the Declaration of Independence. A lot of people don't know that he was one of the co-authors with Jefferson, and he has his own scribbled notes about that. The Adams family, of course, produced 2 presidents, and we have all of their family papers, and they produced a lot of other distinguished people, ambassadors and writers and so forth. We have all of their papers at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And we have a whole group of people working next to take the original and put it in typescript so that scholars can access it remotely. Now, this document, which is several pages long, was written by Paul Revere. And this is his account of what happened. And it was written to the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society because they were the people And in those days, since it was the first one in the country, they called it the Historical Society. It was started in 1791. This was written, I think, in 1798. So we have the original story of Paul Revere. Next.
Bill, do you want to read some of that text there?
All right, dear sir, having a little leisure, I wish to fulfill my promise of giving you some facts and anecdotes prior to the Battle of Lexington, which I do not remember to have seen in any history of the American Revolution. In the year 1773, I was employed by the selectmen of the town of Boston to carry the account of the destruction of the tea to New York, and afterwards, 1774, to carry their dispatches to New York and Philadelphia for calling a Congress, et cetera, et cetera. And it goes on. Of course, he describes how he was hanging the lantern and rowed across the river and managed to be captured short of Lexington. But luckily, Dawes, who went the land route, got through. If you want to read the wonderful story of that period, Stacy Schiff, who is a Williams graduate, wrote a wonderful biography of Samuel Adams, who is much less known, but arguably as important as any of the other Adams. Next. Now, what might surprise you is that we are the repository of Thomas Jefferson's architectural drawings. He drew this himself, and this was the first iteration of Monticello. The reason we have all of this is back to that Coolidge family that I showed you, that property. How are we doing on time?
We're okay.
We're okay. Thomas Jefferson's favorite granddaughter, who lived at Monticello with him, fell in love with a young man who journeyed down there from Boston with a letter of introduction from John Adams. And his name was Joseph Coolidge. And they married and had children. And their firstborn was named Thomas Jefferson Coolidge. And there have been 4 Thomas Jefferson Coolidges. They all reside, needless to say, at Mount Auburn. And over the years, they managed to make a lot of money. And they bought up all of these drawings and all of these papers and artifacts that had been dispersed at Jefferson's death because he was a bankrupt. He was very good at spending money, but he was not very good at making sure there was money in the coffers. And so whatever he may have wished to do with his slaves, he had no choice. They were property, and they were, they were sold to meet his bills. And the house, as you may know, went into rack and ruin until it was bought by a Jewish naval officer in the mid-19th century and saved, much like Mount Vernon was saved by the Ladies Association. And luckily, the Coolidges saved these drawings. And we have hundreds of them. And it's quite, I love to twit my Rhodes classmate, whose name is John Randolph, and he's from the Virginia of the Randolphs. And I tell him that it's all very well to go to Monticello and see these in the visitor center, but if you look down at the bottom, it says Original Mass Historical Society. So we're very proud of this. Next. All right, just a couple of other interesting scenarios. I was not a, shall I say, consequential board chair. I wrote bylaws, I got committees organized, I did a lot of administrative work, which helped the society, I think, in the long run. But one of the exciting moments of my tenure was we had to decide, would we accede to Putin's request to borrow a little pen we had. It is the only pen that Abraham Lincoln used to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. In those days, they didn't have multiple pens as they do now. And a Massachusetts congressman said, can I have the pen? And he said, sure, here it is. So it came to the Historical Society. Putin was celebrating the anniversary of the freeing of the serfs and wanted to have items from the United States having to do with our emancipation. We were very nervous about sending this little tiny pen to Russia, so we sent it to Washington instead and packed it up with all the stuff that was going from the Library of Congress. And believe me, I was very relieved when we were informed at a board meeting that in fact had come back safely into our keeping, because Putin was known to keep a few things if he really liked them, like somebody's, I think didn't he keep somebody's football ring or something? Anyway, so that was one little fun, but we have a lot of amazing things as well as papers there. So it was always fun to hear what was going on there. Okay, final institution, the Friends of the Public Garden. Here we have the Boston Common in the middle of downtown Boston, the Public Garden next door, and the Commonwealth Avenue Mall running down Commonwealth Avenue. The Friends of the Public Garden was founded in 2021 to provide private money to support these parks. They had fallen into terrible disrepair. And one man single-handedly kept raising money from his friends to add to the funds that the city put into them. Next. So during my tenure on the board, we did a massive restoration of this fountain, which is from 1868, bought by a Bostonian. It was exhibited at the Paris Exposition in 1858 and brought to Boston. Needed a lot of work. We dug up this whole plaza next, put down new paving. We're only about 18 inches over the top of the subway system, so the MBTA was very nervous about what we were doing here. Next. Planting trees, grass, restoring. So this is all private money going into the public parks. And I worked very hard with our staff to create memorandum of understanding with the Parks Department so that we could have a joint operating. They were, of course, very happy to have our funds, but we wanted to make sure they were doing things at the best, highest standard of landscape care. Next. Next, it's right in downtown Boston, and we created this wonderful plaza, and then activated it by having the umbrellas and having food trucks come in, and it had been sort of a dead space, run down. Now it's a vibrant thing in the center of Boston, right in front of Bullfinch's State House. Next, the last project I worked on was a $5 million 50th anniversary project to restore the entrance to the public garden. We dug out the sculpture and basin that was there. It was sinking down into the ground. We had to provide recycled water so the fountain wasn't using water all the time. Next. And recreated this back to a wonderful entrance to this magnificent space, and redid all the landscaping as well. Next. So you have these two fountains, the whole new plaza, all the new planting. Next.
I think we're,
And I got to be at the ribbon cutting. So.
Bill, I think
For listening. I don't think you could get the sense that I had a wonderful time exercising all my interests of history, horticulture, historic preservation, and helping all of these institutions get a little better and be solid financial footing and work on into the future. And I thought this was a good place to end, because this is Ron's permanent view and will be mine at the appropriate time. And I just want to urge all of you having just gone through the death of a loved one, talk to your children, talk to your spouses, plan ahead, don't leave it unsaid what you want. It was enormously helpful to me to know exactly what Ron wanted, and I was able to carry it out. As some of you, including John Vipond, who, bless his heart, drove all the way up from Pennsylvania to attend. And some of you have seen it on the live stream. But I had to deal with many families at Mount Auburn, and it was the worst days of their lives, and it wasn't fun for any of us if no one had made any plans in advance of a death. So sit down, choose a funeral director, talk to your funeral director, decide what you want to cremated, burial, where, et cetera, and you'll do your family a great favor. So thanks a lot. Great to see you guys. And I hope you all get to Mount Auburn and the public garden and the trustees of reservation properties over the rest of our lifetimes.
Bill, thank you very much. That was really just a wonderful presentation, and certainly one of the things that we see through those pictures, all the things that you've done. One of the questions that I had was, you didn't mention how much time you had to spend raising the funds for all of these things.
Well, as my trustees used to remind me when I would talk to them about a pay raise, they said, you have it pretty easy. You know, we have all this money coming in, you're selling real estate. And about 80% of the lot sales went into the endowment. And you know, timing is everything. When I came in 1988, and I left in 2008, what were the markets doing? I left just before the 2008 crash. My successor had to deal with that, cut back on the budget. So every year I had more money to spend. We did a 3-year rolling average, as most nonprofits do, took 4.5%, tried to get to 4. So I had a big head start. But yes, I did do a lot of fundraising. I started, in fact, fundraising at Mount Auburn, and I started a group that's still going called the Historic Cemetery Alliance, which is made up of presidents of these historic cemeteries. And they all looked at Mount Auburn and said, we've got to start fundraising too, because these are very expensive things to run. You can see all the built structures and the landscape. But I got to enjoy it, because as a very dear friend who coached me on this said, Bill, you know, you are just helping people do what they want to do. You don't write the check. You're telling them about all the wonderful ways in which they can use the money they want to give to other people. And we had wonderful, wonderful donors, and they've gone from strength to strength.
That's great.
One donor, I'll just tell one little story, who he was an ornery older man, and he liked to have his way. And he kept saying, you know, I can change my will. I mean, he was going to leave us money in his will. And I said, yes, I know that. And but I'd like to have a path here named for my wife. Well, it was a little tiny path. I thought, okay, we can do that. And I want to have this, I'm going to pay for this walkway around this pond, and I want to have a little garden here with a plaque in it. I said, well, okay. And luckily for me, he eventually died not having changed his will, and we've gotten close to $2 million from that over the years. So we didn't get the money. He left it in trust, of course, being a controlling guy. So we have to apply to the bank every year for it.
Ron Bodison has a question.
Yeah, Ron.
Yeah, my favorite memorial at Mount Auburn is Trim Tab. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, that's Buckminster Fuller. And it's such a typical Mount Auburn story, because people today know Buckminster Fuller and they're intrigued by the Trim Tab. which I'll get to in a minute. But actually, the lot belongs to the Fuller family, and Margaret Fuller, who was a very famous 19th century feminist, is buried there. And if you're, a 19th century historian, that's the reason you want to go there. But anyway, the point being, they are family lots, and you've got multi-generations of a family. And her uncles have two enormous obelisks. I would love to know how they got them up to the top of Mount Auburn, just outside the tower. And in unbelievable fashion, their whole life history is on the tower. And they were God's gift to man, if you read everything. I mean, it was incredibly ego-centric.
Paul?
But Trim Tab is a little device that steers a larger body. You think of a sailboat, a little rudder will steer a big sailboat. It's the same, presumably, with a big tanker. And I don't know why I don't know enough about Fuller to know why he had that, but it's sort of an intriguing. Glad you saw that. That's just down the street, so to speak, from the Bulfinch Monument.
Paul, you've got a question.
Bill, thanks for your presentation. I had to drop off for a second because I got a call from my daughter, who's a doctor she lives in Manchester by the Sea.
Oh, yeah.
And I told her what I'm involved in, and she says, well, say thank you to Bill Clendaniel for me.
Well,
because she and her family have enjoyed the trustees' properties tremendously. The Coolidge Reservation, their daughters went to summer camp at Appleton Farms and at the Crane Estate. I've been hiking in Bartholomew Cobble with my son and his family. So and we've Long Hill. We went to visit the Long Hill house. And
well, needless to say, I was just one actor of many. All of these things are team efforts. And
right.
I wasn't even the point of the spear at the trustees. But yeah, it's, I was on a ferry once to Martha's Vineyard with one of our board members, and he worked for the Sheraton Corporation. And we were leaning on the rail looking at the ocean. And he said, we build these hotels, and in 20 or 30 years, they're going to be turned down. But what you're doing is forever. And that stuck with me and makes me feel good towards the end of my life, not the end of it yet, that, what I've done is for the long term. And that's very gratifying.
They look great, and they're well appreciated. They're very well used and very well appreciated.
Well, the trustees have gone from strength to strength. I'm very admiring of what they've done over the last, that was, 40 years ago I worked there. Every once in a while somebody sort of remembers who I was, but I'm way in the past. My favorite expression, which we should all keep in mind, is the cemeteries of the world are filled with indispensable people. None of us are indispensable. We are here, we do what we can do, and then we're gone. And within an appallingly short time, we're probably forgotten.
Are there any other questions that I've got? Because I think we're nearing at the end of our time. And Harry, Alan, you've got a question.
Well, this is one of the questions that we talked about in our prep session. Bill, if you had known what you were going to do with your career, would you have taken different courses at Williams? And if so,
yes.
Would they be?
Yes. I definitely would have taken geology, partly because, Ron and I went to, I think we counted up 24 countries in our time of traveling. And I always wished I knew more about the geology of what I was looking at. But it would have been useful to know more about the stones at Mount Auburn. We have a wide variety of stones, and indeed around the Trustees of Reservation properties. The other one, obviously, if I'd taken biology, probably would have been, I don't think they had botany, but I would have liked to have known more about plants. As I said, my depth of knowledge is very thin on so many of these subjects. All I was bringing the right team together, guiding them, and listening to expertise in all of these fields. I knew nothing about cemeteries when I went to Mount Auburn. I mean, they bury people, but what else do you do? I mean, it was, but it turned out to be the cemetery side, the business side, actually turned out to be much more interesting than I ever imagined. You end up being a therapist for people, and you have knowledge that they need at a very important time in their lives. And it feels very good to be able to give them that knowledge and help them through that period of time.
Any other questions?
Let's see, can I?
Yes.
Yeah.
Susan?
Oh, thank you very much. That was wonderful. And your sense of aesthetics and of taking something that had been somewhat neglected and transforming it is just absolutely wonderful. And I owe you gratitude on behalf of my family because, as you know, we were associated with the Historical Society through some relatives whose papers and things are there. And then also my grandfather and his parents and family going back are at Mount Auburn. And so I have a personal thank you to you, as well as a thank you from the perspective of history and aesthetics.
Thank you.
Bill, thank you very much. This is really just a wonderful presentation, and really we get a feel of all the different things that you've been involved with. And the thing that I think amazes me is your memory of all the different things that you've done, and being able to stay in touch with so many people has helped to make all of that work. And I just want to thank you. And we have coming up on February 13th. We have our next Zoom, and Harry, I was just going to ask you if you could just give a little bit of because I don't see Mark here, and we were going to have Mark Robertson, and we're going to have him speak to us at our next Zoom meeting.
Well, I think it's pretty exciting. Mark, as we all remember, started his work at the college with our class, and those of us who went to Gettysburg were impressed with meeting him. And since then, he's been a great supporter of reunions of the class. And I think this will be the first time we'll have an employee of Williams College talking to us. And so he's working on some things that could be very interesting to us. I think higher education today, admissions at Williams, how the arts and athletics are balanced, and of course the new WICMA, which will be inaugurated when we have our 60th reunion. So I think it'll be a pretty exciting time. He loves the class, and I think many of us know him and like him. So save February 13th for the next Zoom session.
We had a wonderful time speaking with him the other day, and he's just a wealth of knowledge about what's going on in the college today. He's at the center of what is going on, and it is just, I think it's going to be a great presentation. So if there are no more questions, certainly people can stay on, but I just want to thank you, Bill. That was really just a great presentation.
Perfect. Pleasure going back over a long period of time and reliving a lot of interesting times.
So we're going to leave the microphone open for a while.
Yeah, you can unmute if you'd
I'm going
like.
to unmute and give Bill a nice round of applause. He can't hear us if you're muted. So
You want to stop the recording, Ellen?
Yep.
we'll stop the recording.
Thank you, Bill.